nuclear weapons can seriously compete with the internet and antibiotics for the title of the main invention in the history of mankind. It's almost impossible to find scientists who deny that atomic bombs have caused a sharp increase in the number of global conflicts since the middle of the last century. Of course, there are many wars on the planet, but in terms of human history, nothing has changed. Unfortunately, there have always been wars, and probably always will be. Nuclear weapons only reduce the number of wars on a huge scale. After all, everyone understands that the battle with mutual destruction is meaningless. But is it mutual destruction? Is it not a historical myth? Is nuclear winter real? We'll talk about this in the next couple of minutes, learning more about nuclear weapons. Our first stop will of course be at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Terrible, and fortunately the only catastrophes with the use of nuclear weapons. They're easiest to use as a reference example, an example that will instantly run into the first myth about atomic bombs. It lies in their allegedly insane lethality, which caused Japan's instant surrender. This is not true, because Tokyo has undergone almost the same destruction without any nuclear weapons. On March 10, 1945, in a single day, 334 US B-29 bombers destroyed 40% of the city housing. This is about the same amount as the atomic bomb destroyed in Nagasaki. And in terms of victims, the situation was similar as well. According to the most conservative estimates, 80,000 people died in one day of bombing Tokyo. Actually, from the point of view of World War II, there was not much difference between atomic weapons and classical bombing. On February 13 and 14, 1945, about 100,000 people died after the Allied raid on Dresden. And we don't even touch chemical weapons. It easily competes with nuclear. In 1935 through 36, 275,000 Ethiopians died from Italian chemical attacks. The number of victims of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki could not be compared not only with the main battles, but even with the usual ones of the Second World War. For a couple of weeks of the Bialystok-Minsk battle, the USSR alone lost 341,000 people. And the losses from the atomic bombings are far from what forced Japan to surrender. They lost much more people from conventional bombing, and they capitulated because the USSR entered the war. This, on August 17, 1945, stated Emperor Hirohito and called it as the main reason. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not mentioned at all in the paper. And as for the subsequent events, the fact that no one really knew how many atomic weapons the United States had and was not aware of the real extent of destruction in Japan played a role in forcing the fear of it. By the way, this is the second myth about atomic weapons. It lies in the thought that the bombing supposedly wipes out entire cities from the face of the Earth, making the Earth uninhabitable. In reality, everything is again not quite so. With an air explosion with a capacity of a megaton, the zone of complete destruction is less than 4 kilometers. Zone of medium destruction is about 7 kilometers. And at a distance of 10 kilometers, only 5% of the population will die. And now we're talking about a classic modern bomb. But on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 10 times weaker ones were dropped. The main damaging factor in Hiroshima was fire. True, the buildings were typically Japanese, made from wood and cardboard. Geographic location also played a role. Indeed, in the hilly Nagasaki, a fiery tornado did not arise, and most of the brick buildings continued to stand. In other words, atomic bombs are scary, but they did not turn huge cities into dust. We can say that now everything has changed, because since the time of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nuclear potentials of countries have increased significantly, and humanity can throw tons and tons of bombs at each other. And this is also a myth, because nuclear weapons are insanely expensive. You can often find statements that the bombing of Tokyo in World War II is the result of the work of thousands of people and ammunition. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki were defeated with just one bomb, and nuclear weapons are much cheaper to fight. It's not true at all. The budget of the Manhattan Project in 1945 was 90% of the total US expenditure on small arms, and almost 40% of the total cost of tanks. 2 bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki cost as much as tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft. And the money that was spent on them was like money spent on 9 out of 10 rifles made by the USA. But this is only a bomb that still needs to be delivered. The budget for the creation of the B-29 bomber is even larger than one spent on the atomic bomb, and is generally considered the most expensive project of the Second World War. Okay, you can say that we're talking about development and further production is easier. This is also a mistake, because the production of an atomic bomb is really, really expensive. And most importantly, it must be constantly serviced. For example, the US are currently upgrading its W-80 nuclear warheads, and each will require $75 million. Between 1940 and 1998, the US spent $5 trillion on its nuclear arsenal, according to a book by nuclear expert Stephen Schwartz. For comparison, this is China's 25 annual military budgets for 2021. In general, we can't call atomic weapons cheap, and the United States, Russia, and other countries are reducing their nuclear potentials not out of the kindness of their hearts. If nuclear weapons were so cheap and simple, these potentials would only increase. We are not so naive to believe in humanism and the destruction of nuclear arsenals for the sake of humanity, are we? If you're still in doubt, the following myth will dispel your doubts. It lies in the simplicity and safety of atomic weapons. Allegedly, without a fuse, they can play football and nothing will happen. This is partly true, but in life, everything is much more complicated. And in history, there are many incidents related to nuclear weapons. For example, an investigation by the National Interest showed that at least 1,200 US nuclear weapons between 1950 and 1968 caused dangerous incidents. And that doesn't mean some tea was spilled on the warhead. In 1980, a worker in Arkansas dropped a wrench socket into the shaft of a Titan II rocket. It punctured the rocket's first-stage tank, causing a leak. Personnel were evacuated as a matter of urgency, but at 3 o'clock a.m. on September 19th, a W-53 nuclear-tipped missile exploded. The 740-ton cover of the mine was torn off like a feather, and even though the warhead seemed to remain in order, the U.S. command did not feel better at all. So the next time you scold yourself for arms growing out of the wrong place, remember that poor fellow worker with the wrench. There was another, also a quite dramatic story. On January 24, 1961, a B-52 carried 2 thermonuclear bombs 260 times more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then suddenly, a fuel leak was discovered, which led to the destruction of the aircraft and the death of the crew members. The bombs were unhooked from the planes according to the instructions, but the parachute opened only on one of the 2. Also, 3 of the 4 fuses went off, putting the bomb on alert. And only a low-voltage switch saved the United States from a catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. Well, and the second bomb was scattered over the land, so that the plutonium charge and a bunch of radioactive debris had to be looked for by engineering troops. And now remember that more than 1,000 incidents like these have happened in just 17 years. And the question of why countries reduce nuclear weapons will be decided by itself. It is insanely expensive, dangerous, and fraught with insane consequences. Okay, we've figured all these out and move on to other myths. For example, about the irreversible radioactive containment of the area. A small spoiler may be that Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not quite populated. And if we give more details, the radiation intensity 7 hours after the explosion of a nuclear bomb dropped 10 times. After 49 hours, 100. And after 343 hours, 1,000 times. Between 1945 and 1970, Japanese bombing survivors had twice the normal rate of leukemia. It's scary, but we're still talking about no more than a percentage of the total amount. Moreover, within a year after the bombing, 400,000 American soldiers were controlling Hiroshima. At that time, they did not know about radiation sickness and wore their ordinary clothes. And yet, no mass mortality was recorded. Once again, we recall the mostly wooden cities without specialized shelters. If they were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the casualty figures would be completely different. At Bikini Atoll, for example, the Americans tested a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb. And 4 years after the explosion, biologists arrived and found something interesting. Meter-high corals bloomed right in the explosion crater, and the underwater ecosystem was completely restored. In general, the transformation of the Earth into a nuclear desert, even with the explosion of all atomic bombs at the same time, is not worth waiting for. This myth was already debunked. You can find all the details on YouTube. But in short, the myth said that a nuclear war would split the Earth was invented during the Cold War. In reality, a ground explosion of an incredibly powerful 58 megaton munition, similar to the SAR bomb, will create a funnel with a diameter of about only 200 meters. There is even a very simple formula that calculates the consequences of such explosions. By the way, to create an artificial Lake Chagin in 1965, a well 178 meters deep was dug, and the funnel still turned out to be about 100 meters deep. Splitting our blue ball and breaking through the Earth's crust is definitely not even hypothetically an option. It's something of an urban legend. The same can be said about the guaranteed tenfold destruction of life on Earth if all nuclear weapons are detonated. The average yield of current warheads is about half a megaton per each. But even if you take a 5 megaton bomb, calculate its deadly effect, and divide it by the total surface of the Earth, you get somewhere around 70,000. Mankind does not have so many bombs of this class. There are only about 13,000 of them. And even then, the overwhelming majority are many times weaker. And finally, if people want to create such a number of warheads, they will run into the myths that we have talked about earlier. This will require gazillions of budgets, and the risks of accidents and incidents will be such that no one will go for this. So in summary, we would like to note that unfortunately, or fortunately, nuclear weapons are still not as scary as they're considered by the masses. They will definitely bring humanity back to the Middle Ages, but there's still no talk of global extinction. Recently declassified U.S. intelligence data states that according to their calculations, 100 warheads are enough for countries to effectively maintain power parity and prevent a third world war. Will humanity succeed? We'll wait and see. Well, that's all for now. Until we meet again, my friends.